In 1957, Soviet and American forces stood ready for war. American bombers soared through the skies from all corners of the Earth. With a frightening force of 1,500 B-47 jet bombers, the policy of the American military was clear: peace through deterrence.
There was no question that the SAC, the Strategic Air Command's fleet of B-47, with their nuclear power, absolutely could not be stopped. It was a Pax Americana resulted from it, because no one could contest the power that the B-47s represented.
This dominating force, soon to be strengthened with an even bigger and more powerful jet bomber, the B-52, demonstrated to the world that American air power could not be matched. But this air power was dependent upon a silent partner.
The B-47 represented where technology was going. We were into nuclear bombardment, all high altitude. And a lot of what was going on was to figure out the feasibility of a jet bomber. It burned fuel at a great rate. Could it, in fact, carry out its promise? And of course, the secret of all that was air refueling.
Piston engine tankers initially solved this problem, but their slow speed made refueling the jets difficult.
We refueled initially against the KC-97, the propeller-driven aircraft. The contest there was different than it was against the KC-135. It was a lot easier at higher altitude. Flying against a KC-97 at night in a B-47 is arguably one of the more difficult flying tasks that ever existed.
I recall refueling one time behind the KC-97, and all of a sudden there was just a big cloud of black oil from his number 3 engine that let go, and we disconnected, and he was behind us in an instant, and we were gone. It's one of those things. Fortunately, we didn't have a midair, but it was just, he slowed down so instantaneously, it was just like he hit a brick wall. But when the jet tanker came, the KC-135, all of that went away. The airplanes were similarly configured with jet engines and swept wings, so that their turbulence was about the same, and it was much easier to fly because you flew it at altitudes and speeds that were compatible. So it just revolutionized the transfer of fuel.
On the 28th day of June 1957, SAC received their first jet tanker, the Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker. Based on the legendary Dash 80, Boeing's 707 prototype, the KC-135, made aerial refueling of the speedy jet bombers a much easier and safer task. The jet tanker was very similar in size and design to the bombers, and could fly at the same speeds and altitudes. Capable of transferring 1,000 gallons per minute, KC-135 dramatically improved the intercontinental range and reliability of SAC's airplanes, strengthening the presence of American deterrence in the wake of a massive Soviet missile buildup. And as the United States became seriously involved in the conflict in Southeast Asia, the KC-135 also emerged as an integral part of that American effort. It provided vital support for American forces, enabling them to sustain aerial operations round the clock. During the conflict, the KC-135 dispensed a remarkable 9 billion pounds of fuel. KC-135s also served admirably in the Persian Gulf War, adding yet another chapter to its proud legacy. Throughout its service, in addition to its primary tanker role, the KC-135 has been modified as an airborne command post, a transport plane, a weather aircraft, and as a zero-gravity trainer for American astronauts. At the dawn of a new century, the KC-135 stands poised and ready to continue a legacy which has pushed it into the realm of the world's great planes. People have always dreamed of flying, but early airplane designs hardly gave them much hope. But on the 17th of December, 1903, mechanized flight finally left the realm of the absurd. Few could have known that Orville Wright's modest flight of 120 feet would revolutionize our concept of time and space. For nearly 5 years, few even knew of the Wrights' historic success, as it was virtually ignored. The skeptical public had to see it to believe it, and the Wrights, concerned with patent issues, refused to make any public flights. Still, the Wrights made considerable progress with their machines. In 1905, one of their flights spanned a remarkable 24 miles. Even so, their feats were still ignored. Thus, it was another aviator who first captured the imaginations of the American public. On July 4th of 1908, Glenn Curtiss completed the first official public flight of 1 mile. Although the Wrights had flown much further, no one had officially witnessed them. For his success, Curtiss was awarded a trophy from the Scientific American magazine, the first prize ever offered for achievement in American aviation. While Curtiss's flight was celebrated at home, the Europeans were already well on their way to much more significant feats of aviation. Until the summer of 1909, the English Channel had kept unwanted visitors out of Britain for 900 years. Ironically, it was a Frenchman who symbolically shattered the illusion of this natural moat. On the 25th of July, 1909, Louis Blériot took off from Calais and steered his Model 11 monoplane out over the English Channel. Less than 37 minutes and 24 miles later, he landed on the coast of England, his feat heralded with unprecedented public attention. Back in America, the public's new fascination with airplanes prompted the New York World newspaper to offer $10,000 to the first person to fly from New York City to Albany. On May 19, 1910, Glenn Curtiss rose to the challenge in a new plane, the Gold Bug, a replica of which is shown here. The flight of 142 miles took him just under 3 hours. Even with his success, it was clear that American flyers could not match the distance of their European rivals. The Americans, crippled by continued patent fights and lawsuits, were no longer the leaders in aviation. Blériot's crossing of the Channel had prompted the British newspaper The Daily Mail to state, "Air power will be as vital to us as sea power has ever been." European leaders also felt this sentiment and had quickly become interested in the military implications of the airplane. Planes like this British Farman bomber demonstrated that Europeans were serious about air power. In the late summer of 1914, Europe descended into war. A costly stalemate developed, and both sides fortified their positions in trenches dug deep into the earth. The pressures of the war pushed technology forward at an extraordinary rate, but this did little but sustain the horrific and bloody stalemate. The war raged on land, in trenches, at sea, and for the first time, in the air. Military strategists from both sides were anxious to use aircraft, but a degree of uncertainty hung over how to best use them. Most of the 150,000 airplanes used were reconnaissance planes. The planes usually were armed with machine guns, and the infamous dogfights of the war took place between opposing scout planes. but many pilots complained that they had to return for fuel once the action got started. Although a few planes managed to fly 1,000 miles, the thirst for sustained range was never quenched during the war. Dreams of crossing oceans or continents were still unfulfilled, but not for long. Once the war ended, the quest to conquer distance resumed. And when on the 14th of June, 1919, John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown crashed their converted World War I Vickers Vimy bomber into a bog along the Irish coast, another milestone had fallen. They had flown the 1,880 miles from Newfoundland to Ireland in 16 hours and 28 minutes, and etched a place for themselves in aviation history. The 1920s was an exciting time for aviation. The large surplus of airplanes from the war found their way into the hands of stuntmen and daredevils, eager to put on a show. Despite this often carnival atmosphere, people began to universally recognize how much aviation was changing the world, and many dreamed of flying vast distances. The first attempts at aerial refueling took place in this area of stunts and daredevils. One of these courageous aviators, American Wesley May, was the first to test the idea in 1921, and it was an astonishing sight. This daredevil feat was a definite success, but hardly a proof of concept. In August of 1923, a more practical approach was tested by a pair of military aviators. Using a simple hose and cable system, Captain Lowell Smith and Lieutenant John Richter kept their de Havilland DH-4 biplane aloft for 37 hours and 15 minutes by refueling twice in flight. Even with this success, aerial refueling remained merely a stunt. The next attempt would not come for nearly 5 years. Commander Carl Spaatz and his crew of 4 took off in their Fokker trimotor monoplane on New Year's Day, 1928, aiming to stay in the air for a week. While in flight, they were refueled 43 times by a single-engine Douglas biplane. They came down half a day short of the initial goal due to engine trouble, but few could argue their flight was anything but a success. Aerial refueling still held little interest to aviators because the refinement of the piston engine had given most aviators all the range they cared for. Other early uses of aerial refueling were limited purely to efforts by pilots to set new endurance records. John and Kenneth Hunter, teased by the press as having nothing better to do, used aerial refueling to stay in the air for an incredible 553 hours. When they landed on July 4, 1930, the two brothers had spent nearly 23 days in the air. Grounded by a bad oil leak, the Hunters had set a new endurance record, but aerial refueling was still regarded as merely a stunt. During the Second World War, there were only a few experiments with aerial refueling, mostly by the British. The bombers on both sides of the conflict were capable of reaching their assigned targets without the need for refueling. But changes in technology and uncertainty in the post-war world would soon combine to bring aerial refueling to the foreground of aviation. The dawn of the Cold War began even before the dust of the Second World War had settled, and left American leaders scrambling to develop a new strategy for this new world. One of their responses was the formation of the Strategic Air Command, established on the 21st of March, 1946. For the strategy of deterrence to succeed, the United States had to demonstrate the ability to carry out offensive and defensive operations around the world. The creation of SAC gave the U.S. a new force dedicated to this goal. The B-29 served brilliantly in the Pacific Theater during World War II and soon found a new home with SAC. The speed, firepower, and range of the B-29 allowed SAC to project its power far from home. Within 2 years, the Boeing B-50s began to replace the B-29s. With more powerful engines, the B-50 would eventually become the first airplane, with the aid of in-flight refueling, to fly around the world. Another bomber which joined SAC in 1947 was the Convair B-36. The enormous B-36 was the first SAC bomber to have near intercontinental range without the need of aerial refueling. Although these piston-powered bombers remained vital to SAC's plans, piston-powered fighters did not. When the force was initially formed, two stars of World War II, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-51 Mustang, were pushed back into service with SAC. But their tenure was destined not to last long. Experiments such as putting jet engines on the older Thunderbolts proved unsuccessful. Before long, fighters specifically designed to harness jet power were assigned to the Strategic Air Command. Lockheed's P-80 Shooting Star emerged as SAC's first jet fighter in 1947, and at the end of the year, there was a signal that jet bombers would not be too far behind. On the 17th of December 1947, the first prototype of Boeing's jet-powered B-47 gave the Air Force notice of the tremendous speed and power offered by a large jet. However, this speed and power was greatly compromised by the jet engine's thirst for fuel. Without air refueling, a revolutionary jet bomber would be virtually useless. Six months later, SAC activated the first two tanker squadrons. Without a specifically designed tanker, they were forced to convert older bombers, like these B-29s, into tankers. Without a viable American system for aerial refueling, the U.S. was forced to rely on the British. Boeing converted one of their B-29s as a prototype to test the British system. Fuel for transfer was put into two large tanks that were put into the bomb bays of the B-29. A large wheel with 230 feet of 2-inch hose was installed aft fuselage of the tanker. Machinery capable of reeling the hose in and out of the tanker was also installed, as well as controls for the valves and pumps for the fuel system. To make contact, the receiver was equipped with a reception coupling on the aft lower right-hand side of the fuselage. This included a winch for a hauling cable for dragging the hose into the coupling. Controls were also installed on the receiving aircraft to control the flow of the fuel. Because the system would have to function at all altitudes and in a variety of environments, Boeing tested the process at simulated Arctic conditions. With temperatures of minus 65 degrees, the hose was tested and high-octane fuel was transferred successfully. The system itself was rather complicated and required well-trained crews on both aircraft and pilots with a high degree of skill. With the operators in position on both aircraft, the two B-29s maneuvered into position with the tankers above and to the rear of the receiving aircraft. The receiver operator then wheeled out the receiving line, which had a windsock attached to it, to hold it out horizontal as near as possible to the rear of the plane. In the tanker, the operator lowered a contact with a heavy weight on the end. The tanker pilot then made a normal procedure crossover and entangled the two lines. The tanker holds position while the two lines were reeled in. The tanker operator then disentangled the lines and connected the line to the hose coupling. As the hose was played out, the drawing line pulled it toward the receiver. After locking everything into place, the transfer of fuel could begin. This system was basically the same setup as had been used in the late 1920s, and this technological inadequacy showed. The transfer of fuel was slow, and an operator was required on the receiving end, thereby eliminating the possibility of refueling single-seat fighter aircraft. For aerial refueling to be an effective part of the military strategy, a better system needed to be developed. Another British system was tried and found to be far more successful. When using the probe and drogue system, the tanker drags a hose that has a windsock attached to it, which holds it relatively stable. The receiver aircraft then maneuvers into position, actually flinging the point of his receiving nozzle into the cup of the nose fitting. While this system had its merits, it proved to be a difficult task for the pilot of the receiving aircraft. As this film from the test flight of the F-104 shows, there were practical difficulties with the probe and drogue system. Part of the problem here is that the tanker is a modified superfortress and is barely capable of traveling a speed fast enough to keep up with the jet-powered F-104. The jet is constantly on the edge of stalling and wavers beyond the pilot's control. The erratic behavior of the drogue only complicates the process. The greatest virtue of the probe and drogue systems was the light, compact array of equipment, which proved to be ideal for the United States Navy, who was constantly concerned with storage and positioning on aircraft carriers. The United States Air Force, however, pursued a different course. During the late 1940s, the Boeing company had begun the technology that would lead to the revolutionary flying boom system. The initial tests were conducted without any transfer of fuel. Boeing was concerned with the motion of the aircraft and the complications of docking. As tests continued and the boom was attached to the receiving aircraft, it was discovered that the boom also served the function of stabilizing both planes. Boeing then conducted the test in rougher air, and once again, the boom helped maintain the positions of both aircraft. These tests were conducted with converted B-50 bombers known as KB-50s and the B-47 jet bombers. Problems concerning the speed difference between the two aircraft surfaced, and Boeing knew that eventually it would have to be resolved. The differences in the planes meant that the KB-50s, and later the KC-97, had to fly at nearly top speed, while the B-47 had to slow to just above their stall speed. This wasted quite a bit of fuel, as the jet bombers had to keep diving and reclimbing to altitude. Boeing became completely convinced that there was a need for a jet-powered tanker, and they began working on a design. The $16 million Dash 80, unveiled on 15th July 1954, remains one of the most legendary airplanes in history. With their early recognition of the tanker problem, and with the success of the B-47 and the potential for the new B-52, Boeing gambled on the future of the jet. The Dash 80 was the prototype for both the 707 and the KC-135, which far succeeded the initial hopes of the Dash 80 designers. The first deliveries came in April 1957. And as the KC-135 worked its way into the Air Force's fleet, aerial refueling immediately became safer and more reliable. Capable of a top speed of 600 miles per hour, the KC-135 had little trouble keeping up with the equally fast jet bombers. The aircraft's instant success led to early increases in orders for the KC-135.
base turn to follow. Okay, looking. Rolling through the notch. No, they went behind.
When contact has been established and the two aircraft begin moving to established positions, the boom operator moves into position. The process is a dangerous one, because anytime two aircraft are asked to move into close proximity, a number of risks exist.
And ground X-rays in from the long ways out where we rolled in from this morning.
The aircraft crews are well aware of the dangers which arise during these maneuvers. The two planes must essentially fly in formation. Here, a B-52 inches into position to refuel from the KC-135. The similar designs of the two jets allow them to fly in formation with relative ease.
We're just entering base turn to follow. Okay, looking. Tally. Rolling through the notch. No, they went behind. Do not roll.
You can see how the boom operates as a stabilizing mechanism. The two jets can fly at the same speed and altitude without difficulty. This was a major change from the earlier days of refueling jets with piston tankers. The incompatible speeds of piston-powered aircraft and the jet airplanes added an unwanted element of uncertainty into aerial refueling. Flying formation with a jet just above stall speed and a piston tanker essentially in a dive at near top speed was an unenviable task. Refueling jets with jets was a revolutionary change.
Wind 21012, altimeter 29901, report. Okay, copy that. We'll call you straight in pursuit to 6 Delta Bravo.
But while introduction of the Stratotanker made the job easier and safer, aerial refueling remains a dangerous maneuver. A single error during a fuel transfer can result in tragedy. In 1966, an aerial refueling mission between a KC-135 and a B-52 ended in disaster. The two planes collided, leaving a trail of wreckage on the coast of Spain. The shattered remnants of the two planes paints a vivid picture of the cost of a mistake. Pilots of the KC-135 must face this stark reality each time they link up with another aircraft. There are few pilots in the Air Force who don't face danger during their daily missions. But few face danger from the potential mistakes of their fellow crewmen as often as the crew of a KC-135. Much time and effort is put forth by the Air Force to ensure that every member of the crew understands the importance of their jobs. Training begins on the ground with lectures and demonstrations. Crewmen must learn the intricate details of the refueling process, as well as the nuances of operating a large jet. While in the classroom, the crew becomes intimately familiar with the mission and hardware of their craft. These long hours of classroom training provide vital instruction and preparation for the KC-135 crew. And even once this training is done, the crew are a long way from boarding and flying the aircraft. Classroom instruction is followed by long hours of training in a KC-135 simulator. Simulators like this one allow the Air Force to train their crews in a safe environment. Pilots and crewmen can practice their jobs without the initial fear of damaging a multi-million-dollar aircraft. Modern simulators have saved the Air Force countless lives and airplanes by allowing crewmen to hone their skills in a realistic setting. The routines of the job must become second nature to the crew, for they will need all of their concentration if something goes wrong. But simulator training is a supplement, not a replacement for training in the aircraft. As members of the Strategic Air Command, this KC-135 crew must be on alert at all times. We often think of only bombers and fighters on constant alert, but their silent partner must also be ready at a moment's notice. The increase in jets within SAC made the KC-135 an even more valuable member of the fleet, as it provided support for bombers and fighters. Surrounded by a star-studded cast, it is often easy to overlook the beautiful design of the KC-135. Powered by 4 turbojets, mounted under wing swept back at 35 degrees, the KC-135 is a huge and powerful jet. It can carry 120,000 pounds of transfer fuel. When fully loaded, the KC-135 is 120 tons of metal and fuel, hurtling through the air at 600 miles per hour. The KC-135 has a range of more than 11,000 miles at maximum weight and can fly up to heights of 50,000 feet. The airplane is 136 feet long, with a wingspan of nearly 131 feet. The power, speed, and reliability of the airplane greatly improved the effectiveness of the fleet of the Strategic Air Command. With its immediate success, it did not take long for the Strategic Air Command to use the airframe of the KC-135 for other tasks, including perhaps the most important mission flown during the Cold War. One of the primary concerns of the American military was their ability to command, control, and communicate with its nuclear forces. To further secure this concern, SAC decided they needed an airplane to serve as a fail-safe command and control center for American nuclear forces in the event that ground-based command centers became inoperable. This new mission was codenamed Looking Glass, as it was to mirror the command on the ground. A modified KC-135, reconfigured under the designation EC-135, was rebuilt with all the elements necessary to command and control the American nuclear forces. An intricate computer network was placed inside the fuselage of the airplane, along with direct links to the American nuclear arsenal. On the 3rd of February 1961, an EC-135 Looking Glass left the ground, beginning one of the longest missions in military history. A Looking Glass aircraft, complete with a general on board, stayed in the air for 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, for more than 29 years. This airborne mission only ending with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. Before 1960, few Americans were familiar with the wet terrain and harsh jungle climate of a small coastal country in Southeast Asia. Within the next decade, 2.6 million Americans would serve in these jungles and wetlands of Vietnam. The influx of American troops and supplies from half a world away called on all the resources of the American military. It did not take long for the KC-135 to emerge as a pivotal partner in the operations in Vietnam. American involvement in Vietnam began as an advisory role. As the North Vietnamese scored victory after victory, this advisory role dissolved, and the U.S. became entrenched in another nation's civil war. Full-scale military operations were implemented, and more American supplies, in particular aircraft, made their way over to Vietnam. Massive airstrikes were deployed with a two-pronged strategy. They were designed to stop the Viet Cong's movement towards the south, while simultaneously crushing their resolve and forcing them to the negotiating table. American planes dropped more bombs on this small country than had been used in World War II, an effort which would never have been possible without the KC-135. The KC-135 served as the Air Force's workhorse, yet, ironically, its need had been initially overlooked. As the bombing raids over the North began, the American military did not anticipate a need for air-to-air refueling. The primary aircraft to be used in the fight were the F-104s and the F-105s, both aircraft with adequate range for the missions. But before long, American pilots became intimately familiar with the gas stations of the sky. These speedy jets could never have been refueled safely or efficiently with a piston engine tanker. The reliability of the KC-135 allowed American pilots to focus on their missions and to carry more armaments without concern for fuel. In what became a standard procedure, KC-135s would join an attack strike and wait to fuel the fighters and bombers for their journey back to the base. The heavy use of jet fighters and bombers ensured the KC-135 services were in high demand. During the war, these tankers flew a total of 194,687 refueling sorties, and transferred 9 billion pounds of fuel. These airplanes even helped in other ways, on some occasions acting as mid-air tow trucks to damaged aircraft. Pilots would latch their damaged planes onto the refueling boom, and the KC-135 would tow them home safely until they were within gliding distance of the base. Vietnam may be known as a helicopter war, but the service of the KC-135 was second to none. The importance of aerial refueling is such an integral component of military aviation that it's hard to imagine how air forces ever survived without it. The high-tech, high-speed jet so beloved by the Air Force would be limited weapons at best without the support of tankers like the KC-135. Boeing's airplane and their flying boom system brought predictability and safety to a task which was once wrought with danger and uncertainty. These gas stations in the sky are a long way from Wesley May's first test of aerial refueling. Aerial refueling, which first came to light as little more than a daredevil stunt, is today an indispensable component of modern military aviation. Boeing's ability to simplify and modernize the method of aerial refueling was matched by their vision of the need for a jet to handle the job. The success of their jet tanker has been so great that there is rarely a mission in which it is not involved. The military recognizes the vital role the KC-135 plays in their strategy and success, and not surprisingly, its service is far from over. Today, the KC-135s have been re-engined, strengthened, and supplied with modern computerized systems. These upgraded stratotankers will serve well into the next century. By the time they are retired, they will have been in active use for a remarkable 6 decades. Although the KC-135 is often overshadowed by huge bombers and sleek fighters, these planes are dependent upon it. As a silent partner to nearly every plane in the military arsenal, the KC-135, with a legacy of only success, is one of the world's great planes.